So good to see you all. My name is Reem Bastus. I am the newly hired creative director at the Washington Studio School. I'm thrilled to welcome you all. And before I introduce our speaker, I would also like to offer a special thank you to our amazing staff, without whom none of this would happen. Madeline Sargent is our managing director. So Madeline. And then Rachel Bolander is our communications person. And Shiva Amanti is where's Shiva? At the front desk. She's our administrator and registrar. And then we also have our certificate coordinator, Elena Spatz. Can you help me with the last name? Spacek. Okay. So I just am really happy that you all took the time today to come to this incredible talk. I would like to introduce Healoha Johnston, our speaker tonight. Healoha is currently Director of Cultural Resources, Curator for Hawaii, the Pacific Arts and Culture at the Bishop Museum in Honolulu. Formerly, she was a curator at the Asian Pacific American Women's Cultural History at the Smithsonian Institution, and chief curator at the Honolulu Museum of Art, curator of Hawaii, Oceania, Africa, and the Americas. So a little bit of personal information with respect to how I met Healoha. It was 13 years ago, and I had a crazy party at my place. It's true. And in walks this person, and I'd never met her before, and we completely hit it off. I knew she was interested in art, and she was studying for her graduate degree at the time, and it's been a really special friendship ever since. Healoha has curated an exhibition of mine at the Honolulu Museum of Art back in 2015. She is fierce in all the right ways. She makes things happen, and I think that what we're going to see right now is something really special, because when people think of Hawaii, they don't think about the work that you're about to see. And this is what I'm hoping to bring to you today, a bit of an element of surprise. So without lingering any further, please join me in welcoming Healoha Johnston.
Thank you, Reem, for that introduction, and thank you for everyone here for joining us at the Washington Studio School. And as Reem mentioned already, thank you to my new colleagues who I've just learned, who I've just met here in the past week, but have come to know very, very well. Very grateful for the invitation to be able to share with you folks tonight a little bit about the art in Hawaii. And the nature of tonight's conversation, I've titled this lecture, Shaped by the Elements. Art and Resistance in Hawaii. And I'm taking as my point of departure an exhibition that is on view right now at the Smithsonian at the National Portrait Gallery. I'm not the curator for that show, but Kate LeMay is one of the curators there. And together, she and a fellow co-curator organized an exhibition that's called 1898, U.S. Imperial Visions and Revisions. And it's up until February 25th. It looks at the Spanish-American War of 1898. And this is the 125th year anniversary that marks that pivotal point when the U.S. empire spread across oceans, and Hawaii was a part of that. Absorbed into the American fold after 1898, but that history and U.S. occupation and involvement began in 1893. And so I'll talk a little bit about that, but actually through the perspective and the words of an incredible, iconic, in fact, activist and scholar named Hananike Trask. She said, "Our culture has to be the core of our existence." And this line has motivated scholars and artists to situate their work within the political sphere since she spoke them at a conference in 1985. And you have to imagine how bold it was for her to say these words in 1985 at a time when people were not necessarily thinking critically about the relationship between Hawaii and the United States on the level at which it is happening today. At this conference in 1985, she explained that aloha aina, which means literally the love of the land and love of country. She said, in quotes, has to do with history, it has to do with genealogy, and it has to do with hurt. In her presentation, Trask attributes 20th century expressions of aloha aina, again love of land and love of country, to George Helm, who was a political leader during the 1970s Hawaiian Renaissance, who derived his understanding and political contextualization of this philosophy from kupuna, ancestors, elders, and traditions. And 19th century Hawaiian patriots who were loyal to the ali'i, the Hawaiian chiefs, kings, and queens, and loyal to the land in their fight against American imperialism leading up to and following the years 1893. As I mentioned, when US involvement supported the overthrow of what was a Native woman-led constitutional government in Hawaii. Trask's articulations of culture as ever-changing yet persistent, as a vehicle for indigenous value systems, and as a source for Hawaiian resistance against US military, emerged out of the Hawaiian Renaissance of the 70s. She insisted that Kamakau Book, Native Hawaiian people, see themselves in political activism. She explained, and I quote her again, that cultural people have to become political. It's not just that political people like myself, again quoting her, have to become cultural. Our culture can't just be ornamental or recreational. Our culture has to be the core of our resistance. And our philosophy as nationalist Hawaiians should be aloha aina, an alternative to tourism and militarism. She was highly visible. She was a professor at the University of Hawaii, and she was unapologetic in her statements. She was known for her grassroots activism, which brought back into consciousness the continued existence of Hawaii as an independent country. And she therefore described Hawaiian as a national identity rather than an ethnicity within the American national identity. And her texts, along with the writings of Noeue Silva, for example, describe aloha aina as a form of governance that existed in Hawaii's ali'i system, pre-monarchy, which was recognized, of course, as an independent country in 1843, and they identify aloha aina as the foundation upon which Hawaii's native formed and led constitutional monarchy based its government framework. So what you're looking at here is a portrait of Hananike Trask that was taken by an artist named Kapuleʻi Landgraf. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this installation. The portrait that I showed you of Hananike Trask is but one of these portraits here. Trask's speeches, panel discussion, and books continue to serve as a launching pad for artists and scholars. Many artists have answered the call to situate their work within the political sphere. Among one of the most impactful tributes to Trask's intellectual legacy is a relatively recent large-scale installation by photographer Kapuleʻi Landgraf. Landgraf adopted the genre of portraiture for the first time when she created this series in 2019. She's been working for many decades, and for the 2019, what was then the Honolulu Biennial, what is now called the Honolulu Triennial or the Hawaii Triennial, she created a series of 108 photographs in a series called Pāpā. And it features Kamakau Book or Native Hawaiian people whom the artist identifies as folks who work across disciplines and initiatives to inspire change in Hawaii. Unified by a commitment to Hawaiian lifeways, the artists approach individuals of diverse backgrounds. So there's educators, scholars, museum collection managers, kumuhula or hula masters, hula teachers, ocean navigators, artists, activists, who she considers to be rooted in aloha aina. Aua began as the artist's response to that speech that Haunani-Kay Trask delivered at Iolani Palace in 1993. So in 1993, Iolani Palace in Honolulu, Hawaiʻi, hosted a huge commemoration of what was at that point 100-year recognition of the overthrow. And that 1993 speech galvanized a lot of political consciousness in Hawaii. The speech that she gave was, "I'm not American." This is how she closed it. She said, "I'm not American, I'm not American, I'm not American." And Trask repeated these words to crowds, huge crowds, 10,000 people were gathered, on the grounds of Iolani Palace to observe the 1893 overthrow, the coup that deposed Queen Kalākaua Era. And over the course of her speech, Trask's words evolved. They went from "I'm not American" to "We are not American, we are not American, we will die as Hawaiians." Landgraf's installation evolved to situate this speech within an international and intergenerational continuum of political protest and aloha. So the text that you see, if you folks look closely, it's a black and white portrait, of course, and then there's text, though, that are on the surface of each portrait in the series. And that text says, "He Hawaiʻi mau, we are not American." And it repeats from top to bottom, and it blankets the faces of all of the sitters. And so, "He Hawaiʻi mau" means "I am Hawaiian for now and forever." And it was a song, actually, that was written during the Hawaiian Renaissance. And it was a call, again, to revitalize culture at a time when Native Hawaiians were protesting the bombing of Hoʻoulu, and when they were revitalizing navigation by the stars, and they were fighting for gathering rights in order to continue to produce artworks that were in very close relationship and actually reliant upon what one could harvest from the earth. So Renaissance came out of that movement. So did these words and this song, which then Kapolani in 2019 adopted and incorporated along Haunani-Kay Trask portrait as well as the others in the series. And I wanted to quote Kapolani because, for one, she's a photographer, like in the truest sense. She says very little, but she commands a presence and is considered an incredible authority within the arts of Hawaii. She's also one of probably the best known artists outside of Hawaii. Her work is in collections all over the world. And she explained, though, about this series, quoting her, "When we put together, it's all about lahui. Lahui is people and country. A collective voice, a collective conviction to correct the wrong. Even though there are only 108 people portrayed in Aua, thousands are represented, including all our ancestors and future generations of ascendants." So what you're seeing here is, a juxtaposition, a very stark juxtaposition between the story that I just shared with you about Kapolani's work, how she situated that within the context of Haunani-Kay Trask's work, how Haunani-Kay Trask situates her work within the work of George Helm, these activists who then helped spur the Hawaiian Renaissance, which I was born in 1979. So I was born, out of this Renaissance, right? So I grew up in a very different Hawaii than my mom did, for example, because of that Renaissance. And because of what I came to know and just expect, for example, that I have a Hawaiian first name. A lot of people don't. There was language revitalization, cultural revitalization, all a part of this Hawaiian Renaissance. And we see it here kind of culminating in Kapolani's work in this portrait of Haunani-Kay Trask. But part of this resistance, when Haunani-Kay Trask says our culture has to be the core of our resistance, and she's calling for cultural folks to see themselves as political folks, what she's also resisting is this imaginary, resistance to the imaginary. So this type of portrayal of Hawaii, very typical. This is a Dole pineapple juice ad. It's pieces in the collection of the Smithsonian. Bishop Museum has many pieces that look like this. When I worked at the Smithsonian, I created a series of educational resources based on this piece in particular, because it describes the way that Hawaiian women were often portrayed. So when you look at this, what you see in the background is a woman who is, sort of like situated in the backdrop to this luxurious experience. For two people who are very dressed up, who are not Hawaiian clearly, but it sort of feeds into a stereotype about the availability of Hawaiian women's bodies, about the accessibility of Hawaii, land and body, and kind of like this, paradisian ideal that people can come and enjoy their luxurious trip in this fantasy world. And resistance to this type of imagery was a big part of what Haunani Trask was talking about. Haunani Trask talked about this experience of feeling a double colonization, being a Native woman, a Native Hawaiian, and a woman, and the way that these types of images fed that double colonization, the impacts of it. And so it is within this context, emerging out of the Hawaiian Renaissance, going through what a lot of people refer to as a sovereignty movement of the 80s and 90s, which again was this, awakening of political consciousness coming out of the Renaissance, where people came to understand our political history much better. And artists started to develop what I'm calling strategies of exposure. And Kapolani was one of these artists, where, when there's a dominant narrative and it is accepted as truth and it is uncontested, what artists started to do then was rely very heavily on a style that looks like almost documentary. And it was a way to put forward something that would seem unmediated and therefore valid and truthful, in a way of almost creating these visual arguments that debunked American authority in Hawaii and debunked these myths of Hawaiian women and debunked this idea that land was to be accessed by all and exploited. And so Kapu was one of these people who basically gave visible to these scenarios that had been hidden or that had been erased. And so Pono'iwi is an installation here that you can see with photographs and shovels suspended from the ceiling. And what's beneath those shovels is Hawaiian salt. And Hawaiian salt is used in ceremonies of cleansing. And this exhibition was first featured on Maui. And the story that Kapolani is describing is the way that there was such severe extraction from areas of Maui that the land was completely disfigured. Mountains were removed, the shorelines were changed, these resources were harvested, sold, to the detriment of the land. The environment completely changed, the wave rights changed, the type of creatures that can live in those environments changed, and the way that people can interact with that land completely changed. And so she starts to tell these stories of extraction. And the shovels, and if you look really closely, there are little holes drilled into those shovels. And when I asked her why the holes, she said, well, what can you dig with a hole, with a shovel full of holes? Nothing. She's like, I'm so tired of this. It is a way of rendering this extraction useless. And so she uses these visual cues to really position herself within a position of authority, and then also beg the viewer to join her in this as well. And to assume a sense of responsibility, but also empowerment for the way that we live in relationship to the land. And then, of course, the salt then cleansing these actions that have taken place. Right next to that image, I have a photograph here of her book. This was a book, actually, that is part of a collaboration. She's part of a two-part collaboration that is called Piliamo. And it's her and another artist named Mark Hamasaki. They're both photographers. And they documented what was the desecration of an area that was paved to put in the H3, which is a big road. And as I understand it, in 1989, Kapolani and Mark Hamasaki both went to these areas that were being desecrated with their camera and found each other there and then started to go every Sunday together to document until they were not allowed to be there anymore. And they took photographs of what was a highly political construction project. It took, oh my gosh, more than 30 years to complete. People protested it for decades because that huge highway covers over sacred and burial lands. And they documented it through their black and white photographs as a form of environmental protest and as a form of resistance. In a way, just like not accepting that this was going to go unnoticed. It's their way of documenting it. And they published a book, so this is the book cover, that was published, but they've also exhibited this series in, I think, 3 different iterations over the years. And with, every time this body of work is shown, it is shown within a different political context. Because with every passing decade, there's an evolved context, right? So there's a different generation of people who are entering into this kind of environment, political environment, environmental, protest. And every time it's shown, I feel like people respond to it in a new way. And it's fascinating for me to see the way that work is part of a politic. It's not something that kind of stays static in its own time that it was made, but rather it does change and evolve. And another artist whose work, I think also participates in these strategies of exposure but links them to climate impacts is an artist named Joy Inamoto. And so what you're seeing here is a jellyfish. And the title of this piece is We Did Not See It Coming. It is ink on paper with thread that traces the tentacles in the form of the jellyfish. And if you folks know, jellyfish are very responsive in an ecosystem. So depending on the nutrients, whether that's pollution or otherwise that are in the water, jellyfish can bloom. And it's often a signal of that ecosystem either being in balance or out of balance. And We Did Not See It Coming by Joy Inamoto also indicates the way that the further removed we are from the land and the water, the less able we are to see these signals. She connects this then to issues of climate change. And as you folks are probably aware, islands in the Pacific see the consequences of climate change quickly, especially low-lying islands where sea level rise has huge impacts on the water table, fresh water. So we see these impacts, but often, they have to be drastic before people are paying attention or before people will take action. And so what she's in many ways begging is to pay attention to the more subtle signs that require us to live a lot more closely to the world around us and to the natural elements in order to see signals like these jellyfish blooms or the jellyfish imbalance. She also, suggests that the jellyfish are like a metaphor for Oceania. She says, you look at them, it's beautiful, doesn't look threatening, but then you touch it and it stinks and then you realize it was threatening. And she says this of development. So like the development and military projects in Oceania, they can be very unassuming at times, you kind of don't see it, and this is where, the discussion between tourism as a veil for militarism. There's been a very close link. A scholar named Lisa Reihana called it militarism, this relationship that one exists to cover the other. And Joy is kind of playing on that visually here by creating a piece that is beautiful and yet is a metaphor for a threat. This is another piece by Joy Inamoto. So Joy is a photographer, like Kokulani, Landgraf, like Mark Hamasaki. She's a photographer. And again, like these artists who are, participating in these strategies of exposure, I feel like they reach a point where there's just such urgency around issues that the use of images becomes very immediate, almost like there's an urgency, right? So they attempt not to mediate the image as a way of just putting forward what is information in order to gather and get people's attention. And this unmediated aesthetic also indicates, of course, urgency, but it doesn't even attempt to draw the viewer in. It's just very point blank. And, in this case here, Joy is not relying on beauty to almost seduce the viewer to look. The sign, if you can read it, says, "Warning, contaminated fish and shellfish. For your health, do not eat." And, these are areas that used to be gathering areas where people could gather limu, which is seaweed, which was part of the Hawaiian diet. Seaweed and poi were staples of the Hawaiian diet, along with fish. And so this idea, though, that we are so distanced from what was once a food staple in the diet, that for your own health you cannot eat it anymore. Again, it's this warning that Joy is flagging for us in case we have missed it. So if we're so removed that we're not seeing these signals ourselves, she's putting it point blank and documenting a sign that states as much in Hawaii. The thing, that I want to point out here is that, of course, Hawaii is part of the Pacific. And so this work, these strategies of exposure are happening alongside other islands within the Pacific that are undergoing similar experiences, some more drastic than others. Katerina Teaiwa is an artist and a scholar. She is a professor at the Australian National University. And we're going to be featuring her work in an upcoming exhibition that opens in November of this year. I'm co-curator along with Yuki Kihara and Joy Inamoto. And we're working with Katerina on an exhibition titled Project Banaba. And Katerina has been researching the island. So Banaba is an island in the Pacific. It's in a group of islands called Kiribati. And it is in Micronesia, but it is south of Hawaii, but not actually too far. And the island of Banaba has been the subject of Katerina's research because, in fact, this is the island where her family is from, but all the inhabitants of Banaba were displaced and relocated because Banaba was mined for phosphate to the point of being uninhabitable. From 1900 to about 1980, there were a series of companies that were interconnected across the United Kingdom, Australia, and Aotearoa, New Zealand. And they mined Banaba, again, to the point where people had to be relocated, and a lot of them ended up going to Romney and Fiji. And the mining began in the late 1800s for guano until 1900 when phosphate was found in the rocks of Banaba by a company that was managed out of England. And what we see Katerina doing here in this exhibition is that she presents her scholarly research along with her own family archive as a way of situating her own personal experience in what has often only been documented as a corporate experience. So if you go to the Australian National Archives, there are a variety of places where when you look up Banaba, what comes up is phosphate mining. Very little about the people, very little. But there's archives and archives and archives and archives about the value of Banaba land to the rest of the world as fertilizer. And so this story, the way that mining in Banaba was justified was that it was framed as being for the betterment, like for the common good. So we need to mine and extract from Banaba to the point where no one can live there anymore, but it is so that we can fertilize and have food by way of mass agriculture, industrial agriculture. And so this fertilizer that was so rich that came out of Banaba enabled that in these countries in particular. Australia, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and then of course England. Now, this show, Project Banaba, it evolves with every iteration. So Bishop Museum is not the first venue to host this exhibition. It has been on view in Aotearoa. It is going to go to Japan, and it's in Hawaii. And the reason it has gone to these specific sites is because that is where the fertilizer went. And so Katarina is only interested in showing the exhibition in places where her ancestors went, because her ancestors were, of course, buried in the land. And when that land was mined and excavated, sometimes 80 meters deep, as she explains, all of her ancestors then were also turned into fertilizer and spread all over the world. And she is following all those places as a way of telling this story. And so Hawaii is implicated in that, because Hawaii was an importer of this fertilizer. So after the overthrow, industrial agriculture took off in Hawaii in an unprecedented manner. It was part of the economic reasons for the overthrow, in fact. And the Big Five, the companies who largely controlled Hawaii's agriculture and economy post-1898, were importing this fertilizer from Banaba. Hawaii, was also importing laborers from Banaba because they were slowly being displaced from their home. And so there's these movements of both land and people because of this extraction that was happening in the Pacific that connects all of these islands. And so this photographic reef, as she calls it, has photographs of her children, her family, her grandparents, her sister, as well as the phosphate miners, as well as the owners of the companies who were doing this to Banaba, as a way of integrating and intermixing these narratives that are otherwise kept very separate and in a lot of cases very hidden. And again, like using this strategy of exposure, she's putting forward very point blank in front of people an archive, both a personal one, a national one, and a corporate one that tells a story that most people really haven't heard. And so what you're looking at here are these large, she kind of mimics the aesthetics of these phosphate bags. So the fertilizer bags, what you're seeing suspended here are like the bags that would have been filled with fertilizer. But on it, what she's done is rendered these pinnacles. So these white fingers are what she calls them pinnacles, and she describes them as bones. So when you go to Banaba, what she has explained is that the island looks like a field of bones because the soil was mined between these pinnacles, and they've since bleached. And what is left are these pinnacles on the land with these huge chasms and valleys that were excavated out. And so the soil was gone, and along with it, then her ancestors also removed, turned into fertilizer, spread. And so these pinnacles have become an emblem, an important emblem of the exhibition. To think about the bones and what does that mean when ancestors have been removed and what looks like remains or exposed bones. And I explained a little bit about how the artist is approaching different islands, different countries to host her exhibition. And for us at Bishop Museum, of course, it was really important, not only because of this particular story and the fact that Hawaii is implicated in this history of extraction by way of importing this fertilizer that came from Banaba, but because it's so important to understand these histories. By understanding these histories, of course, we understand profound lessons that we cannot afford to repeat. And it also makes visible experiences of displacement, extraction, and resistance, which are familiar experiences to so many Pacific Islanders, yet remain less visible, underheard, less seen. And at the crux of Tiaiwa's exhibition, really, is this question. She has asked us this repeatedly. How do we regrow an island? And she asks it with sincerity. This isn't hypothetical for her. She says that kids often respond with the best answers because they'll take it and be like, yeah, this, that, yeah. They don't think it's hypothetical, they just respond. But she keeps asking it, how do we regrow an island? And she asks it with sincerity for the sake of course, restoring Banaba to a place that could once again sustain human life. This question, how do we regrow an island, has global relevance, as people everywhere consider what it means to recalibrate relationships to each other, to the environment, and to the structures that often mediate our interactions with both land and people. Thank you. I wanted to make sure that I left time for questions and answers, and we're a very small group, so I'm hoping that you folks will not be shamed. That you folks will talk with me, ask me questions. If you want me to revisit any of the slides and talk with greater specificity about any of the works of the artists that I introduced or other artists you'd like to learn about, I'm very open and I welcome your folks' questions.
I have a question.
Yes.
And I know the answer, but for the benefit of the audience, I was hoping that you could explain the difference between overthrow and annexation, because that's something that's often confused.
Sure.
And also tell the audience who the Big Five are, and because you mentioned the Big Five.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll start with the first question then. So the question that Reed asked is, what is the difference between the overthrow and the annexation? So, and I made two different years. I said 1893 and then 1898, right? So in 1893, well, let me back up just a couple more years before that. So there's a queen named Queen Healoha, and if you go to the 1898 exhibition, you will see an incredible portrait of the queen. And it's by William Cogswell, and it is one of the largest pieces in the exhibition, and it is very unusual to see a woman of color represented at least as large as life, maybe larger. Her portrait is the same size as George Washington's portrait in that gallery. Very unusual. She ascended the throne in 1891. 1892 was an election year. Hawaii was a constitutional monarchy from 1840. And 2/3 of the voting population in Hawaii put forward a petition to the Queen to revisit the Constitution of 1887. So, if you folks have ever heard of a thing called the Bayonet Constitution, it was a constitution that was forced upon her predecessor. It's called the Bayonet Constitution. And it disenfranchised huge groups of people in Hawaii in 1887. And so the voting population, 2/3 of them, went to the Queen with a petition saying, we need a different constitution. So she proposed a revised constitution to the cabinet. And the people who would have been enfranchised by that constitution were women, Native Hawaiians who had been disenfranchised to some extent through the 1887 Constitution, and then immigrants, primarily Asian immigrants, because that was the biggest population group that was growing in Hawaii. They would have been allowed to vote, which would have then required the economic model for these folks who ended up being the Big Five to change. It would have meant profit margins would have changed. It also would have potentially shifted the relationship politically of Hawaii closer to Asia as opposed to the US in terms of economic markets and tax advantage, et cetera, et cetera. So 1893, there's a group of people called the Committee of Safety. If you go to the 1898 exhibition, you will see a piece that is a collage. It's like a visual collage that has little portrait cards of each of these members of the Committee of Safety kind of in a circle. They overthrew the Queen and they called the US, and well, I don't know that they took the phone, but they got the US to land military in Hawaii, and they called upon the US, claiming risk to American lives. And so US military arrived to find that there was no risk to anyone's life, nothing had happened. And then there was a report, an investigation conducted, and then a report produced by Manning Blount, and this was under President Grover Cleveland. He promised to restore the Queen under an executive order, and there, between 1893 and 1898, there was a lot of discussion about annexing Hawaii to the US. There was a ton of protests out of Hawaii. Hawaii ended up successfully persuading US government not to annex Hawaii. And I mentioned a scholar in here, her name is Noimai Silva, and she wrote a book about what are called the Ku'e petitions. Ku'e petitions were documents that were signed by nearly every living Hawaiian and presented to the US, and that had a huge role in dissuading the US from annexing Hawaii pre-1898. 1898 happens, US is at war, Spanish-American War with these other areas, and basically Hawaii becomes a really important strategic fueling station for the military in the middle of the Pacific. And so Cleveland is no longer president, it's McKinley, and McKinley then says, ultimately that he overlooks law and everything else and utilizes a joint resolution in order to absorb Hawaii. And so this is why there's so much protest, because a joint resolution doesn't apply to separate countries. And I'm an art historian, I'm not a legal historian, I'm also not a lawyer, but Hawaii's political history is very alive. So you don't necessarily have to be a lawyer to know this. This is like, it is emerging as a dominant narrative in Hawaii. This understanding of, Hawaii's legal position, and the way that Hawaii is, talked about as being annexed, but that the tool that was used to accomplish that actually can't legally do it. And so that's why people say illegal annexation. You've probably heard these terms. Where you hear occupation, that's another term that is most often used. And so, Honolulu Trask, and she wasn't alone. She was part of a large group of people, who were building a movement, sovereignty movement, but she was very vocal and very visible. And she said things that were really unpopular at the time. She talked about how Hawaii was being prostituted through tourism. I mean, she used this type of language, it was shocking to people in the 80s. And she had no patience for people who would try to justify it or validate the need for tourism at the expense of, people in place. So that's your first question.
That's the first thing.
Okay.
And then the big five.
The big five. Okay, so what emerged out of, so there was a conflation between economy and government in Hawaii. And so a lot of the people who were in commerce, who were operating these large plantation companies, were also very influential or related to folks in government in ways that really tied the two into what seemed very much like singular interests. Government was very supportive of these agriculture companies to the point where they ended up having a great deal of control over the economy. And so everyone refers to them as the Big Five. And it's these companies, Castle and Cook is one of them, Alexander Baldwin, is just these companies that emerged. And if you also look, there's Dole Cannery, the first president of, after the Queen is overthrown, they establish a provisional government, then a territorial government, and all these kind of characters also are very much involved in government and in politics. So even if they don't hold a seat in government, they are definitely campaigning in order to secure and protect what ended up transitioning a national wealth into a private wealth for these particular companies.
When Hawaii became a state in, what was it, the 50s? I don't remember.
1959.
How did the people feel about that? Or is it a big split between the indigenous people and then all these other people who came in to do business?
There's a lot of writing about that as a plebiscite, and so I don't know the 1959 history really well, except to say that, yeah, a good deal of Native Hawaiians were opposed to it. And at the same time, a lot of people who continue to have been disenfranchised were for it because they saw it as an opportunity to have rights and to have a voice, political authority, political input. So it is definitely a very contentious history. It's just not one that I can fully unpack because I don't understand necessarily the political scenario of the site.
I have another question.
Yeah.
You've been showing us photographs as the artistic documentation of the story. Are there artists who are using other media?
There are other artists whose work I love, in fact. And I can rattle off names, and I could show you folks pictures. I'd be happy to. I don't know how to navigate this to get onto the internet, but I'll just kind of speak more generally. There are contemporary artists. Maile Andrade is one of them, who really was one of these young artists at the time who were revitalizing kapa making. So kapa is it's a textile that comes out of fiber from a tree. So there's a couple of different barks that are used. Rauke is probably the most popular, and it's stripped and then beaten and pounded into a very, very fine lace-like textile. And artists back in the 80s were coming into Bishop Museum's collection in order to relearn how to do it. And they were relearning how to create the dyes, they were relearning how to create chemical reactions in order to achieve colors, because the practice had largely dwindled. And there was a huge population decimation that took place in the 1800s. So, people say between like 7 to 9 out of 10 Native Hawaiians passed away. And so you have to imagine, if you're in the 1800s and you're a child, how much do you know as a kid? And you're the 1 out of 10 left standing. There's very little knowledge transmission that can happen depending on the context that, let's say, that 1 out of 10 child would have been raised in. And so when you have population decimation like that, and there's knowledge transference isn't as rich and robust as it once was, these cultural practices were fading. And the Hawaiian Renaissance really is what reactivated this and brought this back into a really thriving artistic practice. And so Maile Andrade was one of these artists who was working with these materials. And she created, I want to say maybe 2018 or 2019, an installation of Valke, which is that fiber, and she suspended it from the ceiling and created this environment that felt like otherworldly. And so there are a lot of artists who are using materials, but in very unexpected ways, really reinventing how we experience these materials. If you come to Bishop Museum and you see kapa made out of this fiber, you're going to be looking at a high class. And so when Maile, suspended Valke from the ceiling, so kapa is when Valke has been treated to a particular stage. And so she didn't treat it to that stage. She treated it until the momi stage, where she's very resourceful, this artist. So she made it with these strips, this exhibition with strips of wauke suspended. And you could navigate it, it kind of felt like you were underwater, like you were around seaweed, or like you're in a forest. But because it was pounded to the mo'omomi stage, after it was taken down, she could repurpose it because it's still malleable and she could make it into something else. And that's sort of the signature aspect of her practice, is this repurposing, reinterpreting, remaking. And it's definitely, you know, her work is really experimental because of that. And you kind of never know what you're going to get. So she also created, for an exhibition that was organized by the Smithsonian, an outline on the floor that is the outline of the island of Oahu. And she filled it up with canned foods and created what looked like a cityscape out of it. And, you know, this is just the way, I mean, she just uses what's available. And she kind of attributes that to an island mindset. You use what you have, you make sense of it, and you repurpose, you know, and so that's a big part of her work. And I think she has a big influence on a lot of young artists who are also seeing the way that a person can create contemporary art by working like directly from the land. So like there are artists like Mama Maku, who is an artist that was in an exhibition at the gallery at Leeward where Green used to work. And you know, he'd make his own paper and then his own pigments. And it is very closely related to this kapa making that I've described. But they, you know, are works on paper that he puts up with magnets onto the wall. And so it's just this recontextualization of these practices that have been revitalized to the point where you've got young emerging artists who are activating those practices again, but situating them within a contemporary gallery space.
I was wondering, you talked about that this book by Kapulani and Mark had kind of multiple iterations, and it has this beautiful Hawaiian title, but I was wondering if you could kind of talk about what that means for this and kind of what some of the iterations
were.
Yeah.
So it's like the devastation upon devastation. And the photographs in the book show, you know, the way that the land was being stripped and carved, cut, the way that sacred sites were being thrown gravel on, concrete on. And the context is what has changed the most. So in 1989, you know, exposing this type of desecration was not really happening. And it was fascinating because even like, you know, the fact that they had access to these sites and then all of a sudden they didn't have access to the sites is very telling, because then people started to realize, oh, these artists are like implicating us in a form of environmental injustice. And there were laws that were passed that allowed the H3 to bypass environmental, you know, you have to do like an environmental assessment or anything like. There was a law that was passed, and one of the things in it allowed H3 to proceed without having to complete it. And so it became a hugely political construction project, and it had been for decades. There were protests and protests. The fact, though, that it was sort of like slid through. And then the fact that you had these artists documenting this in a way that hadn't been done was brave and very bold. And there was, so the way that it was received at the time, I think, is what has changed over the years. Because at this point, it's like these strategies of exposure are something that we have become accustomed to. We have become accustomed to understanding that these artists are producing an archive that is different from the one that exists that you can go and see if you go to the Hawaii State Archives, for example. And so looking for these narratives and these histories that are not part of the dominant story and that don't just like validate or authorize violence against the land or military presence or aggression. These are the things that I feel like, because of the work that Kapulani and Mark have done, it's like they've kind of conditioned a group of viewers who come to crave this type of archive because we can't otherwise find it. And if you were born, at a particular stage, it's like this becomes a really important form of primary source material to come to understand. Oh, there's another question.
So if you could speak a little bit about the impact of World War II and the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and just what it did to the culture in the sense of safety and vulnerability and violence, and if what art come out of that particular moment in history.
Mm-hmm. So by the time, by World War II, Hawaii had become increasingly militarized. So post 1898, there were, the territorial government was inviting American homesteaders, and then realizing the need to provide a space for the military, of course, because Hawaii was this strategic military station. And so a lot of housing, development, everything was already being shaped around this increased military presence post-1898. I think what was significant in terms of artistic production around World War II is that in Hawaii, of course, there's a huge Asian American population, and there were incredible Asian American artists who were producing brilliant work who were largely unrecognized for their work. And what we see after World War II is a lot of these artists go to college, they go to art school, and then become a lot more active within the arts by the 1960s. And so there's a lot of Japanese American artists from Hawaii whose works you might be familiar with. Shiko Takaizu, for example. There are a lot of painters who come out of Hawaii and who were, born into that experience. And so I think in terms of art production, they were also the Asian American artists who were documenting the concentration camps that were established. And so a lot of that documentation, again, exists in the form of art, watercolors, works on paper, whatever the artists could get their hands on, while being, incarcerated at the camps. And Honolulu Museum of Art has a number of pieces that address those different experiences in the camps.
What's the relationship between, or the nature of the relationship between the Japanese who've come to Hawaii and the indigenous people?
Well, so what I will say is I think that, so in Hawaii, people intermarry. There's a whole lot of cultural mixing that happens in Hawaii. And I think right now there is a lot of visibility around indigenous identity, indigenous knowledge, the role indigenous knowledge will play in climate resilience, in social justice movements, and I feel like there's a lot of recognition of needing allies. And because the Asian American community is the biggest community in Hawaii, it is, really important that they see themselves in that allyship, and so many do. And there's an artist whose work I didn't show here, but I thought of it. I wanted to show all my favorite artists, but we would have been here all night. But actually, Luka Shevsky is an artist, and she's Korean American, and grew up in Hawaii, and she created probably the single most recognizable image of protest that happened on Mauna Kea. And she, put that, so Mauna Kea is a sacred site on Hawaii Island. There are telescopes on the sacred site, and once again, there was a lot of construction that had not necessarily gone through the right, or just even proper policy and consultations, et cetera. Huge protests erupted right before COVID on the Mauna, and in order to protect the mountain from further development that would have put up another much bigger telescope complex. And and actually Lukashevsky really saw herself in that allyship and created a print that she then sold to support entirely bail for people who've been arrested protesting up on the Mauna. And so there's, I do think Hawaii is an incredible site for this type of allyship and this kind of cross-struggle collaboration and work.
Thank you so much, Healoha. I know we could probably stay here all night. So many interesting points of discussion and so many pathways this can go down. So one more time, thank you.